My name is Quinn Perry. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I have been described with the same three words: dependable, composed, and low maintenance. I live in Seattle now, though I grew up in a much smaller town where being good meant being useful. I built a career in corporate strategy. Though, if you had asked most of my colleagues what I did, they probably would have said something vague like, "Oh, Quinn keeps things running." That was always the phrasing. Keeps things running. Not leads, not builds, not architects. Just keeps. I've never been the loudest person in a room. I don't interrupt. I don't posture. I don't attach my name to things unless I'm certain they're finished. In fast-moving environments, that temperament is often mistaken for passivity. In competitive spaces, it's interpreted as a lack of ambition. But quiet is not the same as small. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about dramatic speeches or public humiliation. No one was exposed on a stage. No champagne glass shattered in slow motion. In fact, the most important moment of this story happened without anyone noticing at all. It happened during our company's year-end gala. Crystal chandeliers, a string quartet near the balcony, senior leadership giving speeches about vision and collective achievement. My name floated through the air several times that night, attached to projects that had magically stabilized under pressure. As applause echoed and champagne flowed, I handed in my notice, not to make a scene, but to walk away at the exact moment they finally realized how much they had taken for granted. There was no anger in me when I did it, just clarity. What unfolded afterward wasn't explosive. It was quiet, slow, inevitable. People often assume that power is loud, that dominance requires confrontation, that justice needs spectacle. But sometimes the most irreversible decisions are made in silence. This story is about erosion, not of confidence, but of illusion. It's about what happens when you slowly recognize the role you've been assigned in other people's narratives and decide you no longer consent to it. It's about understanding your leverage long before anyone else sees it. And it's about leaving, not in bitterness, not in chaos, but in perfect timing. If you've ever been the person who held everything together while being treated as replaceable, if you've ever been thanked publicly but overlooked privately, if you've ever felt the strange loneliness of competence, then you might understand why that envelope in my hand weighed less than a sheet of paper and more than the entire room combined. Before I tell you what happened that night, I need to tell you who I was to them. But first, let me introduce the version of me they thought they knew. Have you ever been underestimated so consistently that people stopped seeing you altogether? To them, I was stability. Not leadership, not vision. Stability. The person you called when something slipped. The one who stayed late without announcing it. The one who could sit through 3 hours of circular executive debate and quietly summarize the real decision in 2 sentences. In performance reviews, I was described as invaluable. In promotion meetings, I was described as not quite visible enough. Those 2 phrases lived side by side for years. My title was Senior Operations Strategy Manager, which sounds weighty until you realize what it often means in practice. I was the bridge between sales and delivery, between leadership promises and operational reality, between what we told clients and what we could actually sustain. When projects wobbled, I stabilized them. When timelines slipped, I restructured workflows. When 2 departments blamed each other, I rewrote the handoff protocols so it wouldn't happen again. But the language around my work was always strangely passive. Quinn helped smooth things out. Quinn supported the transition. Quinn assisted in the redesign. Assisted. I learned early that if I corrected people publicly, I'd be labeled defensive. If I corrected them privately, they'd apologize warmly and do it again next quarter. So I stopped correcting, not out of weakness, out of pattern recognition. What fascinated me wasn't that I was overlooked. It was how consistently I was categorized. Reliable, low drama, safe. In meetings, I often noticed something subtle. When I spoke, people nodded thoughtfully. When someone else repeated my point 5 minutes later, usually louder, it became a bold strategic angle. I watched this happen so many times that it became almost clinical, like observing a behavioral study, and yet I didn't resent them. Not then, because being underestimated has its advantages. You hear more. You're invited into rooms where people speak freely because they don't see you as competition. They forget you're listening structurally. They forget you remember. My boss Daniel once introduced me to a new VP by saying, "Quinn is our backbone. She doesn't need the spotlight. She just makes everything work." Everyone smiled. I smiled too. But something about that phrasing stayed with me. Backbone. Essential but invisible. Structural but not celebrated. You don't applaud a backbone. You assume it will hold. And I did hold. I held when a senior consultant left mid-project, and no one wanted to admit we'd overpromised deliverables. I held when the finance team miscalculated margins, and I quietly restructured resource allocation to prevent layoffs. I held when leadership fought over credit, and because I held, things didn't collapse, which meant no one ever saw how close they came. There's a strange paradox in being competent. The better you are at preventing problems, the less visible your value becomes. Crisis averted doesn't make headlines. I became known as someone who didn't need managing, which sounds flattering until you realize it also means you're not prioritized. No one worried about my workload. No one checked if I wanted more visibility. No one asked whether I was building towards something. They assumed I was content, and maybe for a while I was. Because there is a quiet pride in mastery, in knowing you can walk into chaos and map it within minutes, in understanding systems deeply enough to redesign them without applause. But beneath that pride, there was something else forming. A subtle awareness. Not anger. Not yet. Just a question I couldn't quite name. If I stopped holding, would anything stand? At the time, I didn't test it. I just kept doing what I'd always done. And that's when the first small cut happened. The first small cut didn't look like a wound. It looked like a slide deck. We had just closed one of the largest accounts in the company's history, a multi-year operational overhaul for a regional healthcare network. The proposal had been aggressive. The margins were tight. The delivery model, optimistic. Optimistic was the word leadership liked. Fragile was the word I would have used. For 3 weeks before the final presentation, I practically lived in our conference room. I rebuilt the implementation roadmap from scratch. I recalculated staffing ratios. I flagged 2 compliance risks that would have quietly cost us millions if overlooked. I didn't announce that I'd done it. I just did it. The night before the executive preview, Daniel stopped by my desk and said, "I knew I could count on you." It wasn't manipulative. It was habitual. The next afternoon, the executive team gathered in the glass boardroom overlooking Elliott Bay. The CEO dialed in from New York. The VP of Sales, Mark, stood at the front with the polished deck. My deck. Or rather, the deck that had been mine before it was rebranded. I noticed the changes immediately. My name had been removed from the strategy slide footer. The operational framework I designed was now titled Integrated Vision Initiative, led by Sales Strategy. I sat halfway down the table, portfolio closed, pen resting on the paper in front of me. I told myself it didn't matter. Titles on slides were political. Everyone in the room knew who had built the structure. That's what I told myself. Mark presented confidently. He used my language, almost verbatim in some places. When he reached the staffing model redesign, he paused dramatically and said, "This was a breakthrough moment for us." For us, the CEO praised the ingenuity. Daniel nodded along. No one corrected the narrative. No one said, "Actually, Quinn architected that under impossible timelines." No one even glanced in my direction. It was subtle, polite, clean. And that's why it stung. Because if someone had intentionally erased me, I could have named it as hostility. But this wasn't hostility. It was an assumption. The assumption that I would not mind. The assumption that credit was fluid, but my loyalty was fixed. After the meeting, Daniel clapped Mark on the shoulder. "Brilliant framing," he said. Then he turned to me and added, "Great support, Quinn. Couldn't have done it without you." Support. There it was again. I smiled. Of course I did. That's what composed professionals do. But something inside me cataloged the moment, not emotionally, structurally. I replayed the sequence later that evening at home. Not to nurse resentment, but to understand the mechanics. Why had no one corrected it? Because correcting it would have created friction. It would have required redistributing the spotlight in real time. And I had trained them, over the years, to trust that I would not demand that redistribution. I had made myself safe. Safe people are easy to overlook. The following week, an internal newsletter went out celebrating the win. Mark's photo was featured. A quote from Daniel highlighted cross-functional alignment. My name appeared once, in the 3rd paragraph, as part of a broader team acknowledgement. It was an efficient erasure. That was the first cut. Not dramatic enough to protest. Not egregious enough to escalate. Just clean enough to ignore. And everyone did. Except me. What surprised me most wasn't the disappointment. It was the clarity. For the first time, I saw the pattern as something larger than a single incident. This wasn't a mistake. It was a role. I was the stabilizer. The architect behind the curtain, the one who made bold strategies feasible while others stood at the podium. And I had agreed to that role, quietly, every time I chose not to correct the framing. That night, I opened my laptop, not to send an email or confront anyone, but to save a private copy of the original files, time-stamped, annotated, not as ammunition, just as a record. I didn't know it then, but that small act marked the beginning of something shifting, because once you see the pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. And when disrespect is subtle enough to be deniable, it's also subtle enough to become routine. That's exactly what happened next. After that presentation, nothing dramatic changed. That was the unsettling part. No apology, no confrontation, no internal scandal. Just continuity, which in hindsight was the real signal. The next few months unfolded the way they always did. New accounts, revised forecasts, strategic pivots, dressed up as innovation. I remained exactly where I had always been, in the center of the machinery, invisible but essential. But now I was watching, closely. The second incident happened during a cross-department planning session. We were restructuring delivery timelines for 3 major clients. The proposed schedule from sales was unrealistic. Again, I outlined, calmly, why compressing implementation would increase churn risk by at least 12% within the first year. I had the data, historical comparisons, exit interviews. There was a pause after I finished. Then Mark leaned forward and said, "I hear you, but let's not overcomplicate it. We need momentum." Momentum, a word that sounded dynamic but functioned like dismissal. No one pushed back. Daniel shifted the conversation forward. The timeline remained unchanged. 2 weeks later, when the first cracks appeared in that exact model, Daniel called me into his office. "Can you rework this quietly?" he asked. "We don't want to alarm leadership." Quietly, I nodded, and I fixed it again. Here's what normalization looks like. You predict the failure. You're dismissed. The failure begins. You repair it without recognition, and the cycle resets. At first, I told myself this was just corporate reality. No system is perfect. Decisions are political. Credit is fluid. Emotional resilience is part of leadership. I reframed everything. Maybe Mark wasn't dismissing me. Maybe he just prioritized differently. Maybe Daniel assumed I didn't need public credit. Maybe visibility would come later. Later is a powerful sedative. But the incidents multiplied. Emails where my detailed analysis was forwarded upward without my name attached. Meetings scheduled about operational redesigns, without inviting the person who designed the operations. Jokes about how I lived in spreadsheets, as if depth of knowledge were a personality quirk rather than a strategic asset. None of it was hostile. That's what made it dangerous. It was casual. One afternoon, during a quarterly review, a junior manager presented a process improvement that looked strikingly familiar. As she clicked through the slides, I recognized my framework, lifted almost entirely from an internal document I had shared months earlier. I watched her speak with confidence. I even admired it. When she finished, the room applauded lightly. Daniel said, "This is exactly the kind of proactive thinking we need." I felt something unusual then. Not jealousy, not anger, something colder. Data alignment. The pattern had matured. My contributions were becoming infrastructure. Used, repurposed, absorbed, without attribution. Not maliciously, efficiently. And because I didn't protest, it reinforced the assumption that I didn't require recognition. I began noticing the language people used around me. "You're so steady. You never make things difficult. We're lucky you're not high maintenance." High maintenance. The subtext was clear. My silence was convenient. There is a specific kind of disrespect that doesn't look like disrespect. It looks like comfort, like reliance, like praise wrapped in diminishment. You are essential, but not exceptional. Valuable, but not visionary. Needed, but not elevated. And the longer it continues, the more it feels normal. That's the most disorienting part. You begin to question your own calibration. Am I overthinking this? Is this just how organizations function? Does recognition even matter? I told myself it didn't. I told myself mastery was enough. But small internal adjustments began happening without my permission. I started documenting more carefully, saving drafts, archiving version histories, not obsessively, methodically. I began paying attention to who repeated my ideas and how they framed them. I noticed who received immediate affirmation and who was expected to prove their point twice. And I noticed something else. No one feared losing me. They assumed my presence was stable, predictable, loyal, not because they had secured it, because I had never signaled otherwise. There's a strange psychological shift when you realize you've been complicit in your own diminishment, not through weakness, but through restraint. I had chosen peace over correction, stability over spotlight, competence over confrontation. But peace without boundaries becomes permission, and permission becomes precedent. By the time the fourth or fifth incident blurred into routine, something inside me stopped rationalizing. I didn't explode. I didn't confront anyone. I simply stopped interpreting the pattern as accidental. And once you recognize something as structural, you stop personalizing it. That was the moment disrespect became data. And data can be used, not to attack, but to decide. There's a moment, quiet, almost clinical, when you stop asking whether something is happening and start asking why it continues. By then, I understood the pattern, but understanding it wasn't enough. I needed to understand the role I was playing inside it, because roles are rarely assigned out loud. They're absorbed, gradually, through repetition. In every meeting, I noticed how seating subtly arranged itself. Sales and executive leadership near the head of the table. Finance slightly to the side. Delivery managers clustered near the screen. And me, somewhere in the middle, accessible to everyone, owned by no one. I was the bridge, but bridges are not destinations. Over time, I realized something uncomfortable. I had become organizational cushioning. When leadership overpromised, I softened the impact. When timelines slipped, I absorbed the pressure. When communication failed, I rewrote it. I translated ambition into feasibility. But translation is rarely credited. Only the speaker is. There was a particular afternoon that clarified this. We were in a tense budget meeting. Forecasts were misaligned, and there was quiet friction between departments. Voices were restrained, but shoulders were tight. Daniel turned to me and said, almost casually, "Quinn, can you just smooth this out? Just smooth this out. Not lead the resolution, not drive the strategy. Smooth." The language was revealing. I wasn't there to decide. I was there to stabilize. And I did. I restructured the resource allocation model, identified 3 non-obvious cost redundancies, and proposed a phased rollout adjustment that preserved margin without sacrificing delivery. The tension eased. The meeting ended. Later in the hallway, one of the VPs said to me, "You're like our insurance policy." Insurance. Something you hope you don't need, but feel secure knowing it's there. That was when it settled fully into focus. I wasn't being overlooked by accident. I was being preserved in utility. Promoting me would create a gap in the operational layer that no one else knew how to fill. Elevating me would require redistributing knowledge that currently lived only in my head and my private documentation. I had made myself indispensable. Indispensable people are often the least likely to be advanced, because moving them is risky. Organizations protect what stabilizes them, even if that protection limits the person providing it. The role I had been assigned wasn't malicious. It was efficient, reliable, useful, invisible. The quiet adult in the room. The one who never made leadership uncomfortable. The one who could be trusted not to demand more than what was offered. There was an unspoken expectation embedded in every interaction. Quinn will handle it, without complaint, without ego, without escalation. And I had fulfilled that expectation so consistently that it had solidified into identity, at least in their eyes. What they didn't see was that I had begun to separate my internal identity from the role they assigned me. Externally, nothing changed. I remained composed, strategic, responsive. Internally, a recalibration was happening. I stopped seeking affirmation from them. I stopped interpreting silence as neutrality. And most importantly, I stopped assuming that loyalty was reciprocal. Loyalty, I realized, had flowed in one direction. I had been loyal to the system. The system had been loyal to function, not to me. That clarity wasn't painful. It was freeing. Because once you understand the role you've been cast in, you can decide whether to keep performing it or to exit the stage entirely. I didn't make that decision yet, but for the first time, I understood that I had one. And that understanding shifted something fundamental, not in how I behaved, but in how I evaluated everything that followed. The shift didn't happen during a crisis. It didn't happen after another meeting where my ideas were repackaged. It didn't happen when someone else received public praise for structural work I had built. It happened on a Tuesday, quiet, gray, unremarkable. I was at my desk early, before most of the office had arrived. Seattle mornings have a particular stillness in winter. The city feels suspended, as if it hasn't decided whether to wake up yet. I opened a financial dashboard I had built months prior. It tracked delivery stability across major accounts, risk markers, retention likelihood, staffing strain. It was a living map of operational truth. As I scanned the numbers, I saw something that made me pause. 3 of our largest accounts, together representing nearly 40% of projected annual revenue, were stable for one reason: not market conditions, not an executive strategy, not sales momentum. They were stable because of the layered contingency structures I had quietly embedded into our workflows. Redundancies, escalation protocols, hidden buffers. If I removed those, if even one of them failed, performance metrics would deteriorate within a quarter. I leaned back in my chair. It wasn't an ego realization. It was architectural. For years, I had been looking at my work as support, stabilization, reaction. But what I was actually doing was systemic design. I wasn't smoothing edges. I was holding up a weight, and not just weight. Revenue, reputation, future projections. The company didn't just rely on my output. It relied on my foresight. And foresight, unlike task execution, is difficult to replace. I remember staring at the screen and feeling something unfamiliar. Not anger, not validation, permission. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had previously avoided. What would happen if I stopped? Not stopped working responsibly, stopped absorbing beyond my role, stopped compensating for leadership optimism, stopped preemptively correcting structural flaws no one else saw. I didn't intend to sabotage. That's not who I am. But I began to imagine what neutrality would look like, just doing what was explicitly required. No anticipatory cushioning, no silent recalibration. The answer was clear. Things would wobble, not collapse immediately, but strain would show. And then another realization surfaced, one that changed everything. If I left, there was no succession plan, no documentation repository that captured the interdependencies I understood intuitively. No shadow I had trained. No deputy who had been invited into the full architecture, because no one had asked me to build one. They had assumed I would remain, not because they valued me beyond function, because stability is comforting, and I had made stability effortless. That morning, something inside me detached, not from the company, but from the illusion that my loyalty guaranteed progression. I saw the asymmetry clearly. They relied on me structurally, but they did not invest in me strategically. There's a particular calm that arrives when disappointment turns into data. I closed the dashboard and opened a blank document. Not a resignation letter. Not yet. A map. I began listing every core system I directly influenced, every undocumented dependency, every client relationship that relied on my personal mediation rather than formal protocol. The list grew quickly. As it grew, so did a quiet certainty. I had options, not because someone would rescue me, not because a competitor had reached out, not because I was angry enough to burn bridges, but because I finally understood my leverage. And leverage doesn't require aggression. It requires clarity. Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk and said, "We're lucky to have you, you know." He meant it. But I heard something different this time. "We are comfortable having you." That evening, I walked home slower than usual. The air was cold, sharp enough to make breathing feel intentional. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt awake. The shift wasn't loud. No confrontation, no announcement, just an internal realignment. For the first time in years, I stopped thinking about how to optimize the system and started thinking about how to optimize myself. That was the day something shifted. Not in them, in me. And once that shift happens, silence stops being the default. It becomes deliberate. After that Tuesday, nothing about me appeared different. I still arrived early, still delivered on time, still answered emails with measured clarity. But the motivation underneath those actions had changed. Before, my silence had been reflexive, a byproduct of discipline, of wanting to keep the room steady, of believing that competence would eventually translate into recognition. Now, my silence was intentional. That distinction matters. In the weeks that followed, I began experimenting, not with confrontation, but with restraint. In meetings where unrealistic projections were floated, I presented the risks once, calmly, with data. If they chose to proceed anyway, I didn't build hidden safety nets beyond my scope. I documented. I clarified expectations, and then I allowed ownership to remain where it had been placed. It was astonishing how quickly the difference became visible. Not immediately, but gradually. Small inefficiencies that I would have preemptively corrected began surfacing as delays. Minor misalignments escalated into tense follow-up emails. Nothing catastrophic, just friction, the kind of friction I had quietly prevented for years. No one connected it to me, of course. Why would they? From their perspective, I was still the same Quinn, composed, reliable, agreeable, but internally, I was observing. When I stopped cushioning, accountability redistributed itself. Mark, who had often dismissed operational constraints as overcautious, now had to explain timeline slips directly to leadership. Daniel, who once relied on me to smooth budget discrepancies before they reached executive visibility, began fielding sharper financial questions, and I did not interfere. I did my job thoroughly, responsibly, ethically, but I stopped volunteering invisible labor. That was the shift. You learn something powerful when you withdraw unrequested compensation. People begin to see the actual weight of their own decisions. At first I worried this would feel petty. It didn't. It felt balanced. There's a difference between helping and overcompensating. For years, I had been overcompensating for optimism, ego, and oversight. I had done it quietly, almost protectively. Now, I allowed reality to move at its natural speed. One afternoon, a project manager stopped by my desk looking unsettled. "Did you change the escalation protocol for North Shore?" she asked. "No," I said. "It's the same as documented." She hesitated. "It just feels tighter." I understood what she meant. The buffer I used to insert informally, the unofficial grace period I'd negotiate behind the scenes, was gone. "Everything's aligned with the contract," I replied gently, which was true. What had changed wasn't the rules. It was my willingness to stretch them quietly. There's a particular discomfort people experience when the safety net they didn't know existed is removed. Not anger, confusion. Why does this feel harder? Because you're carrying your full weight now. Leadership began scheduling more check-ins. The tone wasn't accusatory, just slightly unsettled. "Anything we should be aware of?" Daniel asked during one meeting. "No, I said evenly. Everything's functioning as designed." And that was true. As designed, just not over-designed for rescue. What they mistook for continued steadiness was, in reality, a recalibrated boundary. They saw composure. They did not see the calculation. They assumed loyalty remained unquestioned. They did not sense an evaluation underway. Silence, when misunderstood, is often interpreted as weakness. But strategic silence is observation, and observation generates clarity. During this period, I also began redirecting energy outward. Not dramatically. Subtly. I attended industry panels I had previously declined due to workload. I reconnected with a former colleague now leading operations at a growing firm in Vancouver. I updated my resume, not urgently but accurately. The act itself felt grounding. For years, my professional identity had been tied almost exclusively to one ecosystem. Now, I allowed myself to imagine alternatives, not as escape routes, but as viable options. Something else changed too. My internal dialogue softened. I stopped trying to prove my value through invisible labor. I stopped equating indispensability with security. And most importantly, I stopped confusing comfort with respect. In meetings, I spoke less. But when I did speak, it was precise. I no longer over-explained to preempt misunderstanding. If my analysis was dismissed, I let it be dismissed, documented and time-stamped. There's a quiet power in allowing outcomes to validate you instead of arguing for validation. Weeks passed. The system adjusted awkwardly to its new equilibrium. They still saw me as steady, but they had no idea I was no longer anchored. And when silence is no longer a default, but a decision, it becomes the foundation for something irreversible. What they never noticed was that while they were adapting to the absence of cushioning, I was preparing something far more deliberate. Preparation doesn't always look like movement. Sometimes it looks like consistency. That was the advantage. From the outside, I remained unchanged. Projects closed. Clients renewed. I attended meetings, submitted forecasts, and delivered quarterly analyses with the same polish I always had. No one sensed acceleration beneath the surface, but preparation had begun. The first thing I did was informational, not emotional. I scheduled one-on-one process continuity reviews with each department lead, not framed as an exit strategy, but as operational hygiene. I asked questions about documentation, succession planning, and cross-training. Most of them brushed it off lightly. "We've got it covered. You're the continuity. We don't really need redundancy at that level." That level, meaning me. I nodded. I didn't push. Instead, I quietly documented the gaps. Not to weaponize them, to confirm what I already suspected. There was no structural backup for my institutional knowledge. Over 6 years, I had accumulated a mental map of client sensitivities, internal personalities, political fault lines, and contractual nuance that existed nowhere in full form. It wasn't arrogance. It was exposure. The company wasn't protected from my departure. It was dependent on my presence. The second thing I did was more personal. I audited my own leverage, not just in terms of systems, but relationships. Which clients requested me by name? Which accounts escalated to me instead of their assigned managers? Which executives relied on my private briefings before board presentations? The list was longer than I expected. I had thought of myself as background, but background, when consistent, becomes a foundation. Next, I began organizing my documentation. Not deleting, not withholding, organizing. I separated what contractual obligation was from what was value added. I created clear process outlines for core responsibilities, but I did not include the intuitive adjustments I typically made to prevent friction. Those lived in judgment, not in manuals. Judgment takes time to develop. I also reviewed my compensation history. Year over year, my raises had been solid, competitive, respectable. But when mapped against revenue growth tied to the operational frameworks I built, the asymmetry became visible. The company's valuation had increased significantly in the last 3 years. My title had not. It wasn't unfair in a legal sense. It was misaligned in a structural one. I didn't react emotionally to that realization. I recorded it. Then came the external positioning. I updated my LinkedIn, not dramatically, just accurately. I reframed my work from supporting operational excellence to designing revenue-stabilizing infrastructure across multi-million-dollar accounts. Language matters. I reached out to 2 former colleagues who had left years earlier. Casual messages, professional reconnection, no urgency. Within a week, one of them invited me to coffee. She now led operations at a scaling health tech firm. During that conversation, she asked a simple question. "What's your real scope where you are?" I answered honestly. She leaned back and said, "You realize that's executive level architecture, right?" I didn't respond immediately, because I had never named it that way. Architecture, not smoothing, not supporting, designing load-bearing systems. The way she said it wasn't flattering, it was matter of fact. That conversation didn't result in an immediate offer, but it shifted something critical. It externalized my value. When you are inside a system for too long, you calibrate yourself to its language. You internalize its framing of your role. Hearing your scope described without minimization is disorienting, clarifying. I returned to work the next day, unchanged in demeanor, but internally the preparation intensified. I reviewed non-compete clauses, notice period requirements, bonus structures tied to year-end metrics. That's when I saw it. My largest annual performance bonus, deferred compensation tied to account stability, would vest at the year-end gala. The gala. An event is usually symbolic, celebratory, predictable. This time it became strategic. If I resigned before vesting, I would forfeit a significant amount. If I waited until after, the leverage shifted. Not as punishment, as alignment. I didn't celebrate the discovery. I noted the timeline. From that point forward, every action moved quietly toward that date. I didn't disengage. I didn't underperform. In fact, I ensured metrics were strong, documented, and defensible. If I were going to leave, I would leave at peak clarity. No performance concerns, no emotional volatility, no ambiguity. The most powerful exits are clean. Meanwhile, small fractures in operations continued surfacing. Not catastrophic, but noticeable. Leadership began asking broader questions about resilience and redundancy. I answered thoughtfully. I did not volunteer that I was the missing redundancy. What they never noticed was that while they were adjusting to minor instability, I was calculating the precise moment when my departure would register fully. Not dramatically, structurally, because here's the truth most organizations ignore. You don't realize where your load-bearing walls are until one is removed. And by the time you understand the architecture, it's already too late to redesign it quickly. The gala date approached. Champagne ordered, awards drafted, executive speeches rehearsed. And in my navy leather portfolio, a single envelope began to feel less like paper and more like gravity. The private reveal didn't happen in a dramatic moment of discovery. It happened in layers. By the time the year-end gala was 3 weeks away, I had already completed most of my internal audit. I knew where the dependencies lived. I knew which systems were resilient and which only appeared that way because I had quietly reinforced them. But there was one final piece I hadn't fully examined. Client trust, not contractual retention, not renewal likelihood, trust. I began reviewing call notes from the past 2 years. Escalation emails, private follow-ups, informal conversations after quarterly business reviews. A pattern emerged almost immediately. When things went wrong, and in any complex operation they eventually do, clients didn't escalate to sales. They didn't escalate to generic support inboxes. They reached out to me. Quinn, can you take a look at this before it becomes bigger? Quinn, I trust your perspective on how to approach this internally. Quinn, off the record, what's really happening? Off the record. That's when it crystallized. I wasn't just holding systems together internally. I was anchoring credibility externally. The firm's reputation for operational stability, the very thing leadership celebrated in quarterly reports, was partly built on relationships that flowed through me personally. And those relationships weren't formally transferred anywhere. They existed because of consistency. Because I responded at 6:30 a.m. when a hospital network's integration stalled. Because I explained uncomfortable truths honestly instead of shielding them behind optimism. Because I followed through without theatrics. Trust accumulates quietly. And quietly, it becomes leverage. Not the kind you weaponize, the kind you recognize. I didn't intend to take clients with me. That would have violated my code. But I understood something profound. If I left, trust would destabilize before revenue did. And in service businesses, trust is the real asset. That realization was the private reveal. For years, I had believed my value was operational competence. But competence can be hired. What I had built was relational architecture. And relational architecture does not transfer cleanly. I scheduled 2 final proactive health check calls with our largest accounts under the pretense of routine review. I wanted to observe something specific, how deeply embedded I was in their confidence map. During one call, the CFO of a regional healthcare group said something that stayed with me. Quinn, I'll be honest. When you're on the call, I don't worry. When you're not, I ask more questions. He said it lightly, as a compliment, but I heard it structurally. My presence reduced perceived risk. That's not something you can train quickly. That's earned through repeated accuracy. I ended the call, closed my laptop, and sat still for a long time. Not in pride, in clarity. If I stayed, nothing would fundamentally change. The system would continue relying on my invisible reinforcement. Leadership would continue assuming my stability was permanent. If I left abruptly and emotionally, I would undermine my own integrity. But if I left at a moment when metrics were strong, bonuses vested, and praise was loud, the contrast would be undeniable. Not because I would explain it, because they would feel it. And here's the crucial part. I did not want them to suffer. I wanted them to understand. There's a difference. Understanding reshapes systems. Suffering just creates resentment. In the days leading up to the gala, award nominations circulated internally. My name appeared on one shortlist for operational excellence. Operational excellence. I almost smiled. It was accurate and still incomplete. Excellence without elevation becomes containment. That's when I drafted the letter. It was 1 page, calm, professional. 4 weeks' notice, effective immediately following the gala. No accusations, no justifications, no emotional language, just gratitude and departure. I printed it on simple white paper and placed it inside my navy leather portfolio. I didn't rehearse a speech. I didn't imagine dramatic reactions. I imagined silence, the kind of silence that follows delayed recognition. And in that imagined silence, I felt something settle inside me. Peace, not because I was leaving, but because I was leaving on my terms. The private reveal wasn't that I had power. It was that I no longer needed to prove I had it. And once you reach that place, where your value is internally confirmed, you stop negotiating for acknowledgement. You start making decisions. The gala was 7 days away. Applause had already been scripted. They just didn't know what would follow it. There is always a moment before something irreversible when the door is still open. You can step back. You can rationalize. You can decide it isn't worth the disruption. The week before the gala, I stood in that doorway. On paper, my situation was enviable. Strong compensation, executive access, autonomy, a reputation for excellence. My bonus was vested. My name was on an award shortlist. Leaving at that moment would look irrational. That was the point. I mapped out the options carefully. Option 1, stay. Accept the award. Continue stabilizing the system. Gradually negotiate for a title change. Hope the recognition compound effect eventually translates into structural elevation. This was the safest route. Predictable, respected. It was also the slowest erosion of my autonomy, because staying meant continuing to compensate for leadership blind spots, while waiting for them to recognize a dependency they had never been forced to confront. Option 2, confront privately, request a formal scope realignment, present data on revenue stabilization linked to my frameworks, negotiate for executive positioning. This appealed to the rational part of me. It would be clean, strategic, assertive, but it also required something I was no longer willing to offer: persuasion. I had already demonstrated value for 6 years. If a value requires repeated argument, it is not misunderstood. It is contained. Option 3, leave before vesting. Make a dramatic ethical statement. Signal dissatisfaction. That option never truly existed for me. My moral code is simple. Never punish yourself to prove a point. I would not forfeit what I had earned to stage symbolic defiance, which left one final option. Option 4, leave at peak visibility. Accept the applause, allow the metrics to close cleanly, let the bonus vest, and then, quietly, remove myself from the architecture. No accusations, no emotional charge, just absence. Absence, when strategically timed, is louder than confrontation. I didn't rush the decision. I tested it internally. Each morning I asked myself the same question. If they offered you the promotion tomorrow, would you trust the system? And each morning the answer was the same. No, because the issue was not titled. It was a pattern. Promotion without a cultural shift would simply move me into a larger arena of the same dynamic. I didn't want elevation within containment. I wanted expansion. The decision crystallized one evening while reviewing the gala agenda. There was a segment labeled Leadership Vision 2026. Mark would speak. Daniel would follow. My name was scheduled earlier for operational excellence recognition. I imagined standing there, accepting the award, smiling for photos. I imagined returning to my seat, and I imagined the envelope still sitting in my portfolio, unopened. In that visualization, something felt incomplete, like postponing truth. The decision point wasn't about anger. It wasn't about proving something. It was about alignment. If I truly believed my value exceeded the container I was in, then leaving required timing that matched that belief. Not leaving quietly on a random Tuesday. Leaving when the contrast was undeniable, even if unspoken. The next morning, I confirmed an external offer. Not impulsively, not dramatically. The Vancouver firm had extended a formal executive-level operations role, one that reflected architecture, not support. Compensation was aligned, authority was clear, reporting lines were direct. I negotiated calmly, accepted terms, signed. No one in my current company knew, and I felt no triumph, only steadiness. When you choose the irreversible option, the noise in your head stops. Doubt quiets. The body relaxes. You no longer scan for validation. You prepare. I placed the signed offer letter in my home office drawer. I placed my resignation letter back inside my Navy portfolio. From that moment forward, everything was set in motion. The gala would proceed as planned. Speeches would be delivered. Applause would echo. And at precisely the moment when leadership felt most affirmed about the stability of their system, I would step out of it. Not to disrupt, but to reveal. Because sometimes the clearest message isn't spoken, it's enacted. The decision had been made, irreversibly. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. Not emotional, procedural. There's a quiet efficiency that settles over you when doubt disappears. You stop rehearsing imaginary conversations. You stop analyzing alternate outcomes. You move, silently. The first step was legal. I reviewed my employment agreement one final time. Non-compete clauses, client non-solicitation boundaries, and intellectual property language. I wanted zero ambiguity. My exit would be clean, ethical, defensible. The Vancouver firm's legal team reviewed it as well. Their conclusion was straightforward. I could not actively recruit clients for a defined period, but I was fully within bounds to transition roles, especially given the geographic and market differentiation. Good. I never intended to take anything that wasn't mine. The second step was financial. My year-end bonus was structured to vest the night of the gala, once final performance confirmations were logged. I verified the documentation timeline discreetly with HR under the pretense of tax planning. Just making sure I understand the payout sequence, I said casually. They explained it without suspicion. It would process automatically within 48 hours. That mattered, not because I needed the money to survive, but because alignment matters. If I had built value that contributed to revenue growth, then leaving before that recognition formalized would be misaligned with my own principles. The third step was operational continuity. This part surprised even me. I began organizing a transition framework, not out of obligation, but integrity. I drafted outlines for system dependencies, key client sensitivities, and risk markers. High level, accurate. But I did not insert the anticipatory adjustments I normally would have. I would hand over the structure, not foresight. Foresight is cultivated. not transferred in bullet points. In meetings during those final weeks, I became even more composed than usual, not detached, precise. When someone proposed a compressed rollout schedule, I provided the data once, clearly, without emphasis. If they chose to proceed, I documented agreement and moved forward. I no longer stretched myself to compensate for optimism. And something interesting happened. Leadership leaned in more. Daniel began asking follow-up questions he would previously have skipped. Mark hesitated slightly before dismissing operational risk. They were sensing something, not my departure, but the absence of invisible correction. They mistook it for evolving culture. It wasn't. It was boundary enforcement. Externally, I also prepared. I scheduled apartment viewings in Vancouver over a long weekend, framed at work as a short personal trip. I didn't broadcast it. I didn't conceal it dramatically either. Just quiet logistics. I transferred savings into a more flexible account structure, updated insurance, reviewed relocation timelines. Every action was deliberate. What fascinated me most during this period was how calm I felt. No adrenaline, no resentment, just clarity. When you act from reaction, your nervous system vibrates. When you act from alignment, it settles. 3 days before the gala, the internal announcement went out confirming award recipients. My name was listed formally. Operational Excellence, Quinn Perry. Congratulations flooded my inbox. You deserve it. So proud of you. Couldn't do this without you. The irony wasn't sharp. It was almost tender. They meant those words. But meaning something emotionally and structuring around it are different behaviors. The night before the gala, I placed my resignation letter into the navy leather portfolio and zipped it closed. I didn't reread it. I didn't modify a word. I slept deeply. On the morning of the event, I arrived at the office as usual, reviewed metrics, sent a routine status update, confirmed a client escalation resolution. If anyone had been watching closely, they would have seen nothing unusual. That was the point. Power rarely announces itself in advance. By afternoon, the ballroom was being prepared downtown. Chandeliers polished, champagne chilled, a stage constructed beneath soft gold lighting. By evening, everyone would gather, dressed in formal wear, celebrating growth and vision. They would applaud the stability of a system they believed was self-sustaining, and I would stand, portfolio in hand, having already moved every piece into place. No one noticed the silence behind my composure. No one sensed that every logistical thread had been tied off, because when you move in silence, the impact is only felt after the motion is complete. The consequences weren't visible yet, but they were already inevitable. The gala unfolded exactly as scripted. Crystal chandeliers, soft gold lighting. A string quartet near the entrance is playing something elegant and forgettable. Executives in tailored tuxedos, laughter layered over champagne. I wore a simple black dress, structured, understated. My navy leather portfolio rested lightly in my hand. From the outside, I was composed, engaged, present, and I was. Because this wasn't a performance. It was closure. When my name was called for operational excellence, the applause was warm, genuine. I walked to the stage, accepted the award, and thanked the team. My words were measured. I've always believed strong systems are built quietly. Thank you for trusting me to help build them. That was all. No edge, no subtext, just truth. Later in the evening, after final speeches and rising toasts, I approached Daniel near the side of the ballroom. The music was softer there. Conversations blurred into background hum. I have something for you, I said calmly, handing him the envelope. He smiled reflexively, assuming it was documentation, perhaps, or a project update. When he opened it, his expression shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. Confusion first, then recalibration. You're resigning? He asked quietly. Yes, I replied. Effective? 4 weeks' notice, starting tomorrow. He stared at me as if waiting for additional explanation. There was none. Is this about something specific? He asked. It's about alignment, I said evenly. No accusation, no list of grievances. Just alignment. He nodded slowly, still processing. We'll talk Monday, he said. Of course. I returned to the room, finished my glass of champagne. Congratulated a colleague on her promotion. Nothing outwardly shifted that night. The consequences began on Monday. Not with confrontation, with confusion. By mid-morning, Daniel had called an emergency leadership meeting. I wasn't invited, which was appropriate. I had already formalized my departure, but word spread quickly. Are you leaving? Is this a joke? Where are you going? I answered politely, briefly. Moving into an executive operations role. New opportunity. Yes, it happened quickly, which was technically true. What fascinated me was the tone of reaction. Not anger. Alarm. Within 48 hours, 3 separate project leads requested extended transition sessions. 2 clients emailed asking for confirmation of continuity. One message stood out. "Quinn, I heard you're transitioning. I hope this doesn't affect our integration timeline." There it was, the first visible ripple. Leadership scheduled a meeting with me for Wednesday morning. The energy was different now. Not dismissive. Attentive. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Help us understand the scope of your current dependencies." Scope. For years, that word had floated abstractly. Now it carried urgency. I walked them through high-level systems. Risk markers, relationship touchpoints. Faces tightened, not in accusation, but realization. "So if you're not here," Mark began, trailing off. "The documented processes remain," I said calmly. "But there will be an adjustment period." Adjustment period. A gentle phrase for structural rebalancing. By the end of the week, small cracks were visible. A delayed deliverable escalated faster than usual because I didn't preemptively intervene. A client follow-up email sat unanswered longer than anyone expected because the nuance wasn't recognized. Nothing catastrophic, just strain. Leadership began holding more frequent internal check-ins. The word redundancy appeared repeatedly. It would have sounded strategic any other month. Now it sounded reactive. What they were experiencing wasn't a collapse. It was exposure. Exposure to the invisible reinforcement I had provided for years. And here's the crucial part. I did not gloat. I did not step back smugly and watch. I conducted my transition responsibly, answered questions, clarified frameworks, but I did not rebuild what I had removed. There's a difference between assisting transition and re-anchoring a system you've chosen to leave. By Friday, Daniel stopped by my office. "I don't think we realized how much connective tissue you were," he said quietly. Connective tissue. I almost smiled at the accuracy. "You built more than we documented," he added. "Yes," I replied. There was no accusation in my tone, only confirmation. The consequences had begun, not explosively, but undeniably. They weren't losing an employee. They were losing architecture. And architecture, once removed, reveals every assumption it had been supporting. They finally saw the load-bearing wall. It just wasn't there anymore. By the second week of my notice period, the tone had shifted from confusion to urgency. Not chaos, urgency. Leadership moved quickly. They reassigned 2 senior managers to shadow my transition sessions. A task force was assembled to codify operational resilience. HR fast-tracked a recruitment process for a director-level operations role, an elevation of the title I had carried for years. The irony wasn't sharp anymore. It was structural. When something functions seamlessly, organizations hesitate to redesign it. When friction appears, redesign becomes a priority. But redesign takes time, and time was precisely what they didn't have. Midweek, Daniel requested another one-on-one. This time, the conversation was more direct. "Is there anything we can do to reconsider this?" he asked carefully. It wasn't a counteroffer yet. It was an assessment. I held his gaze calmly. "I've already committed," I said. "To compensation? Title?" he pressed. "It's not about compensation." That part was true. They could have matched the salary. They could have offered a promotion. They could have created a vice president title and attached my name to it. But here's what they couldn't retroactively create. Cultural shift. 6 years of pattern doesn't dissolve in a week of urgency. He leaned back, absorbing that. "We didn't realize," he said finally, and I believed him. That was the tragedy, not malice. Blind spots reinforced by convenience. By the 3rd week, external consequences began surfacing more visibly. A major healthcare client requested an executive-level assurance call regarding continuity. Not angrily, cautiously. The CFO, who once told me he didn't worry when I was on the call, now asked pointed questions about succession. Leadership reassured him, but reassurance without history is thinner. Internally, the recruitment process hit a snag. Candidates with the operational depth they now understood they needed were either unavailable or expensive. One recruiter reportedly said, "You're describing 2 roles combined." Yes, they were. The conversations around my desk changed in tone. Where colleagues once said, "We'll miss you," they now said, "We didn't realize you were handling that too." That too. Every 2 revealed another invisible thread. The strain wasn't dramatic, it was cumulative. Response times slowed. Escalations felt heavier. Decision-making required more meetings because fewer people held the full context. One afternoon, I overheard a senior consultant say, "It feels like we lost our internal GPS." I didn't react, but I understood. GPS doesn't drive the car. It just prevents wrong turns. And when it's gone, you notice the uncertainty more than the absence. By week 4, leadership made a formal counteroffer. Executive title, expanded compensation, direct reporting line to the CEO. It was impressive. It was late. I read the document carefully, not to consider it, but to honor the process. Daniel watched my expression. "You've earned this," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. That answer surprised him, but it was the most honest one. I didn't say thank you for finally seeing it. I didn't say this should have happened years ago. I simply returned the offer across the desk. "I'm grateful," I said, "but I've already stepped forward." He nodded slowly. There was no anger in the room, just a realization. By the time my final week ended, the architecture had been outlined, but not internalized. The new interim lead understood the documentation, but not the nuance. And nuance is where stability lives. On my last day, I conducted one final client call. Routine, calm, professional. After we ended, the client paused and asked, "Are we in good hands?" I answered honestly, "Yes, the systems are strong." And they were. But systems without stewardship require time to recalibrate. When I packed my office, it took less than 20 minutes. A framed photo, a small plant, my navy leather portfolio. As I walked through the hallway, people hugged me, shook my hand, thanked me. No resentment, no dramatic fallout. Just a subtle, collective awareness that something foundational had shifted. The panic had been quiet. The regret is understated. The realization is slow but undeniable. Too late to fix it, not because the company would collapse, but because trust, once recalibrated, doesn't reset on command. They could redesign titles. They could hire replacements. They could create task forces. But they could not reconstruct 6 years of quiet credibility overnight. And that was never the goal. The goal was alignment. And alignment, once chosen, does not reverse. My final formal conversation with leadership happened on a Thursday afternoon. No grand conference room, no audience. Just Daniel and Mark were seated across from me in Daniel's office. The door closed softly behind us. There was no tension in the air, just wait. Daniel spoke first. "I want to understand," he said. "Not to change your mind, just to understand." That distinction mattered. For a moment, I considered giving the polished answer, the safe one about growth and new horizons. Instead, I chose clarity. For a long time, I began calmly, I functioned as structural reinforcement without structural recognition. They didn't interrupt. I don't mean awards, I continued. I mean architecture. Decisions were made assuming I would absorb the consequences. Credit was distributed assuming I didn't require it. Risk was taken assuming I would stabilize it. Mark shifted slightly in his chair, not defensive, just unsettled. "That wasn't intentional," he said. "I know," I replied, and I meant it. Intent and impact are different forces. Daniel leaned forward. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" It was an honest question. "I did," I said gently. "In data, in forecasts, in risk markers, but not emotionally. I didn't escalate it as personal dissatisfaction. I paused, and that was my choice. There was no accusation in that statement, just shared responsibility. I didn't want confrontation," I added. I believed consistent excellence would recalibrate perception. Mark exhaled slowly. "And it didn't," he said. "It did," I corrected quietly. "It recalibrated perception of reliability, not of scope." That landed. The room was silent for several seconds. Not uncomfortable, just reflective. Daniel finally asked, "If we had promoted you earlier, would this be different?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said, because this wasn't about the title. It was about the pattern. Promotions can change hierarchy. They don't automatically change behavior. There was no defensiveness in their posture now, only recognition. Mark spoke next, more softly than I had ever heard him in a meeting. "We relied on you more than we acknowledged." "Yes," I said. Another pause. Daniel looked down at the desk briefly, then back at me. "I wish we'd understood sooner." "So do I replied, not as a weapon, as truth." The conversation didn't escalate. No raised voices, no emotional spillover. That's the misconception about confrontation. People assume it requires heat. It doesn't. Sometimes the most powerful confrontations are temperature-controlled, measured, precise, final. Before I stood to leave, Daniel said something that lingered. "You changed how this company thinks about operations." I held his gaze. "Then that's enough," I said. And in that moment, I meant it. I didn't need retroactive validation. I didn't need them to fully articulate what had shifted. They understood. And understanding, once it arrives, doesn't disappear. As I walked out of the office, I felt no surge of triumph, no vindication, just completion. The architecture had been seen. The pattern is acknowledged. Not loudly, but clearly. And clarity, when mutual, closes the loop without damage. That was the confrontation. No heat, no spectacle. Just truth spoken at the volume it deserved. Vancouver feels different. The air is sharper, the skyline lower, the ocean closer. On my first morning in the new office, I stood by the window overlooking the harbor and felt something I hadn't allowed myself in years. Lightness. Not because the work is easier. It isn't. If anything, the scope is larger. I now oversee cross-functional operational architecture across 3 divisions. I report directly to the executive team. My decisions shape growth trajectories instead of stabilizing after them. But here's the difference. I was hired for architecture, not cushioning. In my first strategy session, I outlined a phased systems redesign that would temporarily slow expansion to prevent long-term strain. The CEO listened carefully and asked, "What support do you need to execute that?" Not, "Can you smooth it?" Not, "Are you sure we need to complicate this?" Support, execution, clarity. The language itself felt aligned. For a few weeks, I kept waiting for the old pattern to resurface, for my role to shrink subtly into invisible reinforcement. It didn't, because I had changed too. I speak earlier now. Not louder, earlier. When I see risk markers, I name them once, clearly, and anchor them to outcomes. If they are overridden, accountability is documented. I don't overextend to compensate. I don't absorb beyond the scope, not from defensiveness, but from respect. Respect for my own boundaries. Respect for the system's capacity to hold its own decisions. The most profound change, though, isn't external. It's internal. For years, I equated worth with usefulness. If I were indispensable, I would be valuable. If I stabilized, I mattered. Now, I understand something different. Indispensability is not the goal. Impact is. And impact doesn't require invisibility. It requires alignment between contribution and recognition. I still carry my navy leather portfolio. It sits beside me in meetings, not as armor, but as a reminder. Inside it now are forward-looking plans, expansion models, risk simulations, not a resignation letter. When colleagues here introduce me, they say, "Quinn designs the backbone of our operations." And this time, backbone doesn't mean invisible. It means structural. There's a difference. I don't harbor resentment toward my former company. In fact, I feel something close to gratitude. They revealed the pattern. They gave me the data. They showed me, unintentionally, what happens when you are valued for output, but not positioned for growth. And because of that, I recalibrated. Sometimes, leaving isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about proving yourself right. Right about your scope, right about your capacity, right about what alignment feels like. Occasionally, I receive updates from former colleagues. The company is adjusting, learning, hiring more intentionally, documenting dependencies earlier. They're evolving. Good. That was never about punishment. It was about awareness. Who I am now isn't louder. I'm not more aggressive, not sharper edged. If anything, I'm steadier. But steadiness without self-erasure. Competence without containment. Silence when chosen, not assumed. The void I left wasn't meant to collapse anything. It was meant to reveal structure. And in stepping away, I stepped into something clearer. Not a bigger spotlight, a truer position. If you take anything from my story, I hope it's this. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly in the room, taking notes. Sometimes it stabilizes what others don't even realize is unstable. Sometimes it waits, not for revenge, not for applause, but for alignment. When I handed in my resignation in the middle of that year-end gala, I wasn't trying to create a scene. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I wasn't trying to prove that I was irreplaceable. I already knew I wasn't replaceable in the way they had assumed. And that knowledge didn't need volume. It needed timing. There's a difference between being valued and being relied upon. Reliance can feel like appreciation, but often it's convenience. It's the comfort of knowing someone else will absorb the tension, close the gaps, carry the weight. Value, on the other hand, is structural. It shows up in how decisions are made, in how credit is distributed, whether growth pathways are built, not promised. For years, I mistook their reliance for value. That wasn't their fault alone. I had trained them to see me as endlessly capable and endlessly available. I never corrected the framing. I never insisted on visibility. I believed excellence would speak for itself. Excellence does speak, but not always in the language you expect. Sometimes it speaks through absence. Sometimes it speaks through the silence that follows when the person who held everything together quietly steps away. Leaving when you are underestimated is easy. Leaving when you are finally applauded, that's harder. Because applause tempts you to stay. It suggests recognition has arrived. But recognition that arrives only after you threaten departure is not transformation. It's a reaction, and reaction fades. Alignment endures. I don't tell this story to encourage anyone to quit impulsively, or to withhold effort, or to test people with dramatic exits. I tell it because many of us, especially those who are calm, competent, and conflict averse, become the invisible architecture in rooms that celebrate visible leadership. And if you're not careful, you start believing invisibility is the price of stability. It isn't. You can be steady and seen, strategic and acknowledged, quiet and powerful, but sometimes the only way for others to recognize the load-bearing wall is to remove it. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever been the one holding everything together while being treated as if you were simply part of the background? And if you have, what would alignment look like for you? I'd really like to know.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.